Stanford University.
Well, thank you all very much. Is the microphone working? Perfect. Okay. It's always a pleasure to come to California, see colleagues, and see so many enthusiastic students, faculty, research staff, and others really interested in energy and sustainability. And it warms my heart because I live, eat, and breathe it every day, and it's always a pleasure to be here as well. Even though the fog did slow me down a little bit this morning. The topic that I'd like to talk to you about today is to cover in highlight the Renewable Electricity Futures Study that we led out of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, conducted with many colleagues from around the country and reviewers actually from around the world. We released it earlier this year. If you may know, it's up online. I'll show you where that link is, and I don't know if anyone's had time to actually read through the 800+ pages, but I'll give you a quick synopsis of what we did and the highlights from those results. And I think the important part is to recognize that it's an investigation of the technical feasibility of renewable electricity futures for the contiguous United States. It's not a policy study. It's not a projection and things like that. We were really asked to pull together a world-class group of technical analysts, but also electricity sector analysts, to evaluate the technical feasibility of whether or not these futures were possible. And what does that mean from a technical standpoint, i.e. reliability, meeting demand, looking at the variability that's introduced by more and more renewable electricity generation. And the motivation came from, as many of you likely know, but if not, an enormous growth in the renewable energy use domestically as well as globally. This graph just shows a quick synopsis of the growth between 2000 and 2010. You know, this year we're going to surpass 160 gigawatts of installed renewables in the United States, which continues the double-digit growth rate of renewables over the past numbers of decades. And it's really quite enormous, and that's not it's just the tip of the iceberg relative to the fact that there are about 115 countries, I'll put it that way, that have some kind of renewable electricity law or goal in place, and that the renewables really have become, I'll change it from what used to be thought of as alternative to just being thought of as renewable energy. So it's no longer the alternative aspect, but really when you think about it, if you look at the annual growth rates in the United States or elsewhere, it's about 50% of new power additions each year. So it's really matured substantially. So the questions we really had were a technical feasibility analysis. There are really 3 sub-questions here that you can read through very quickly, but just to really concisely talk about them, it's can we meet load with the various supply options that we're going to look at? What's involved in integrating all of that new supply into the grid? And that's a very, very simple question, but incredibly complicated to answer. And I'll get into some of that and some of the variants that we looked at. And can we, I'll call it exercise, some really leading edge models with unprecedented both temporal and geographic coverage for the United States, which really haven't been exercised like this before. And then really explore what are the constraints, what are the synergies, what are the challenges, recognizing again that we're not going to do an in-depth policy study. The report was published earlier this year, 4 volumes, a lot of depth and breadth, wonderful bedtime reading or weekend reading if you don't have enough between now and finals. but feel free to look at it. It's all up online. There were 110 contributors, more than 30 institutions, and probably another 200 or 300 reviewers. That we went through a pretty rigorous process, a little bit like the IPCC for those of you that are familiar with that, where every comment was written down and responded to, and went through a very rigorous review process to get that out the door. Let me highlight here what the study is and what it's not. And I'm not going to read through this, but I wanted a couple of key takeaways. I already mentioned it. It's not a policy study. That would be different. A lot of people would say, oh, isn't that a national renewable portfolio standard? Well, yes, in terms of a quantity, but no in terms of the detail of what a policy like that might look like. A policy like that might look like all sorts of questions around trading, state rights versus federal rights, renewable electricity credits, and banking and borrowing and the cost of those things, et cetera. We didn't look at any of that. So that's why it's not what I would call a policy study. It's a technical evaluation study as well. And then other things to recognize, it's not a full reliability study. It's the best we could do at the national level to basically prove the feasibility that this should be looked at in greater detail. And that's what we're continuing to do. But it's not sub-hourly for power engineers. It's not a frequency response study. It's not a contingency response study and things like that. It's not down in the weeds of that. But what we did do, which has never been done before for the nation, is to look at an hourly basis, meeting load with very different renewable supply scenarios. So that's what we went out to do. There are a lot of things that we didn't do that we hope to do going forward, and I'll lay out some of that in the future as we go forward. The modeling framework, just to spend a minute on this, uses two principal models. One is called the Regional Energy Deployment System Model, REEDS, developed for now over a decade at NREL. This is a linear optimization model in 2-year increments, goes out to 2050. In between each time step actually goes out and does an enormous amount of statistical correlation work and reliability correlation analysis, and then steps back into the linear optimization and moves forward. That is actually structured for the complete United States plus imports, exports to Mexico and Canada. So we do capture those dynamics as well. It actually has the temporal resolution of 17 time slices, which seems kind of coarse per se, but that's 4 time slices in 4 seasons and a super peak. And then what we do with that is actually complement that with 8,760 hours, where we look at that in an industry standard model called grid view. So that's the hourly calculation that we look at, and again, for the whole country. Normally that's done for regions because it's so computationally intensive. REEDS, just to give you a sense of it, it's 1.5 million variables and a few 100,000 constraints. If you're lucky, it'll solve in 24 hours. If not, you have to play with it for a little bit longer. And in fact, one of your Stanford grads is the lead technical modeler these days, and he'll be out here later this week, Patrick Sullivan. So inputs to that came from technical teams on supply and then on the technologies themselves, and I'll go through that in a little bit. And then we looked at the outputs of it. What are the implications for greenhouse gas emissions, actually water, land use, and we looked at some of the economics as well. We also didn't just look at a simple set of scenarios. This is probably where we spent almost the bulk of the time on the steering committee, was designing a series of scenarios or a whole suite of scenarios that could really help inform many of the questions that each of us want to get answered in terms of a technical feasibility. And here you see the suite of some 16 or 17 scenarios, the core of it being focused here on what we call the exploratory scenarios. So what we looked at was national electricity generation, so not capacity, but generation, from 30% to 90%. And then we defined a set of sensitivity scenarios around the 80% scenario. And here's some additional language here relative to technology innovation, so none, incremental, or evolutionary. And then we also looked at a number of different constraints. And I'm going to actually spend quite some time looking at these constraint scenarios and talking about those because they're actually very insightful. So these are the sensitivities that I think we're all quite interested in when we look through these kind of analyses. And then we had some alternatives as well as a high demand scenario, and I'll highlight a little bit of those as well. But you can tell it's very rich in terms of a suite. There's a lot of work that can be extracted and a lot of insights that can be extracted from among those scenarios themselves. And the basic set of assumptions, again, driven by, in this sense, for the demand side of the equation. So we had a whole energy efficiency and demand team run and led by Donna Hostick out of Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. And you can see that that team actually referred back to the National Academy's work on potential for energy efficiency, did some thinking deeply about the penetration of electric vehicles or plug-in electric vehicles, and came up with essentially a fairly what people might call aggressive baseline scenario. I mean, so this going out to 2050 essentially is decreasing electricity demand out to 2050, then with a slight increase from the transportation sector, making it essentially flat. Well, that's fairly different than, I'll call it, traditional growth scenarios, which have energy consumption essentially proportional to growth in GDP, and you would see a 0.5 to 1 to 1.5% growth, which is our high demand scenario. So there's a lot of assumptions built in to the demand side of the equation that we put into our reference scenario, or our baseline scenario, sorry, that have to do with that. And then we want to look at variance around that. Okay, so that's a very solid place and a key thing to remember as we go forward. Resources, these are the maps, many of them that NREL produces. In fact, we update these relatively regularly. So this is a kind of coarse scale maps of the national level of biopower, wind, solar, geothermal, direct solar, so concentrating solar power is CSP, and hydro as well. So there are details of this at very fine spatial resolution on the NREL website, and even more detail in the Western Interconnect and the Eastern Interconnect that we've used for other studies as well. But this is just a quick synopsis of that. I think one of the key takeaways to observe on this is the enormous size of the solar resource, which many of you I think are familiar with, but to give that some context, that's 80,000 gigawatts, right? I think I actually have a mistake in my slides going forward with the wrong number, but that's pretty enormous. And the other ones, and this will come out because we actually did a resource constraint scenario where, in fact, what we did was look at, well, what if this is wrong, or what if you can't get to it, or what if there are siting problems or development problems and things like that, and that'll be another insight. So that sets the background of what we did, and let me just focus then on highlights of the results and then go through some of the scenarios. So the first kind of key takeaway, which was an output of the scenarios, was an output of the analysis because it wasn't predetermined, was can the system actually meet hourly demand at 80% total renewable generation in 2050? And the answer we found was yes. You could, in fact, keep and meet today's technical requirements, i.e. ancillary reserve requirements, contingency reserve requirements, etc., with 80% renewable energy on aggregate across the country, renewable electricity. Okay, and so you see here what the resource map, or not the resource map, the actual power plant map and the transmission map would look like for the 80% incremental technology unconstrained transmission scenario looks like here. And you do note quite a difference. So you see the build out of a lot of solar in the west, a fair amount of wind in the middle, a fair amount of biomass throughout the west, or sorry, throughout the east, and then a significant amount of new transmission. Now I'll contrast that with some scenarios where we in fact constrain the transmission, and you'll see some differences here. And then I'll actually show you some very nice visuals which will show you the build out of this, but also the hourly dispatch of it as it goes through a year, which is actually fairly insightful if you're visually inclined. So that's one of the most fundamental takeaways that came out of the study was this looks like it's technically feasible. We should look at it in some more detail. And what else can we learn? So this is a fairly complicated set of graphs, and let me just see if I can highlight what they're saying. This is the installed capacity in gigawatts as a function of scenario for the non-transmission constrained exploratory cases, if you remember the scenario map. So this is from 30% to 90%, but the demand is the same. And so one of the key things to recognize here is that when you add more renewables to the system, you actually need more capacity. Why is that? Because as an electricity modeler, you give less capacity value to the variable renewables when they increase their penetration going forward. So the 50th marginal percent of wind gets less value to the system than the 25th marginal percent of wind. Okay, and we do that because of the variability, the predictability of the wind, et cetera. That's all been looked at in a lot of detail. There are a lot of references I can help you with on that one. The other, and so hopefully you can read these in the back. These are stacked charts going from nuclear, coal, co-fired coal, gas, co-fired biomass, dedicated biomass, geothermal, hydro, CSP, utility PV, rooftop PV, onshore wind, offshore wind, and storage. The other thing that I failed to mention verbally in the modeling work is that we used a second NREL model called Solar Deployment System Model, Solar DS, to actually model where the distributed solar would be. And we did that exogenously. We put it into this one and then solved the rest of the system. The other piece here then is this is the percent of total supply, and then maybe more importantly is this red line, which is the percent of variable generation as a function of, again, the scenario. And one of the important things that I always emphasize with this graph and also just in the discussion of the study is that when we talk about 80% scenarios, it's 80% total renewables, not 80% variable renewables. So you can see here in the 80% case, it's about 42 if I get the number, if I remember the number correctly. Variable renewable in that case, although it's 80% total. Why? Because we have hydro in there, we have baseload biomass in there, we actually have concentrating solar power, CSP, with storage so that it's dispatchable in there. And even in 90%, it's only about 45, maybe 46% variable renewables. So that's also very important just to remember in the back of your head. We're not analyzing scenarios where it's 100% variable. It's less than 50%. And then here is the energy of the baseline scenario where you see, again, nuclear, coal, gas, and then the renewables here, and again, the flat demand going forward, relative to the 80% unconstrained transmission scenario where nuclear phases out, coal phases out quite a bit, gas slims down, and then you build up renewables on the side. And this was done pre a fair number of changes here in the 2010, 2012 timeframe where you see a lot of switch between gas and coal. It really wouldn't have a lot of impact out in the 2050 timeframe. It would reset the start point quite a bit, and I'll talk a little bit about whether or not fossil fuel prices impact the results of this study, and the answer, just so you can think about it, is not really. And the simple way of thinking about that is that it's really quite a small part of the overall generation. Okay. Another key result, and this is a synthesis across many, many different scenarios is that there are many different combinations of the renewable resources and the technologies available in the United States that would supply potentially 80% of renewable electricity power. And that's important to realize because each state has its unique set of assets. Each region has a unique set of assets, and there may be preferential treatment toward a more distributed future or a centralized future or protecting future, certain land areas or water areas. And that would change the mix. And so the question would be, is there only one solution or is there a whole variety of potential solutions? And the answer is there's a whole variety of potential solutions. So here you see the mapping of, so for example, from solar PV of somewhere slightly less than 100 gigawatts to maybe 300 gigawatts is available in potential solutions. Those solutions vary across those 17 scenarios. Constrained transmission, constrained resources, constrained flexibility, whether or not the technology improves enormously or we actually stop improving now. Same thing with wind. It also varies considerably depending upon demand, and I'll talk about that a little bit future going out. And so here you see the installed capacity, and here you just see the percent of total electricity. There's some notable pieces, for example, solar CSP. There's a scenario where we would calculate that 0 CSP is actually added to the grid. Now, it's not very feasible given what's already in the pipeline, but economically, that's kind of put there. But you could also see that you could build more than 100 gigawatts. And that's dependent upon the technology innovation going forward and the competition with other renewable resources, as well as, and in particular for CSP, the availability of transmission to move it from the desert Southwest to other demand centers. All right. One of the other key messages for us was really captured in the geospatial distribution of the energy supply. And I'm going to show you a second map along this line with constrained transmission, but this is one that captures a lot of detail. So let me just use an example here, California. What you have on the left is the generation, and then what you have on the right is the capacity, and the little dashed line is actually the 2050 demand. So you see in California, basically, you meet the demand on an annual average from resources that are available in the state. Now, that's a different situation for the Northwest, where in fact it oversupplies and therefore exports. Similarly for the Great Plains, where there's a lot of wind and therefore there's a lot of oversupply. And so again, this color map is the same. That's wind up above that line, which is being exported. And there's some deficits in Texas and in Florida, but in the Northeast, in fact, from the offshore wind, they actually have a surplus and they actually export. And I'll show you that on a couple of the visuals going forward. So this is a really important map because it kind of shows where regionally is the supply being met by relatively local resources, or where the trade flows, if I could use that term, between regions. And I deviated from the normal renewable electricity futures talk to put this slide in because I think it's really important. This comes from work that we did for what's called the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a group of 23 energy ministers that get together. And last year they asked us to do a study, to do a comparative international case studies of the best practices for integrating variable renewables. And this was kind of the visual map that came out of it, and there are kind of 5 key steps involved in that, which is everything from expanding diverse geographic resources, enlarging balancing area authorities, developing rules for flexibility of markets, et cetera, leading the public engagement, particularly for transmission build-out, as well as market rules and things like that. And I put this in here as a reflection of what I'm going to now talk about, which is really about what does this flexible system mean if you're ever going to to move toward a very, very high renewable electricity penetration scenario. And this kind of gives the roadmap. That's a whole separate set of publications, but I think it's important to keep these in mind. And so this is kind of, I'll call it a vision, just a bullet list of a lot of those options for flexibility. Everything from demand response, and in fact, we'll highlight some of those demand response aspects in the study. There's increased flexible generation, particularly from the fossil resources, and I'm going to show you some detail of what that looks like. That raises a lot of hands talking to current utility operators in the U.S. Less so if you talk to them in Ontario. Just depends on what's standard and what's practices. Storage, and of course coordinating power markets, et cetera. So this is a really interesting set of results, and there are two extremes on here. One is a set of peak demand days, and this is now hourly calculations from July, 3 days in July, actually 4 days in July, and an off-peak spring day. So in a peak scenario, in the baseline, everything kind of runs as traditionally was designed. You have baseload plants, lots of baseload coal that just run flat out, hydro, which ramps, then natural gas, 2 floats of natural gas, and then you got a little bit of renewables on top of it, and this is the load requirement. Well, if the load requirement that we had is the black line, and then we introduce some demand response, some load shifting capability in the scenarios, and that goes from about 15 or 18, 16 gigawatts to possibly as high as 30 to 50 going forward. That may be actually a conservative scenario and a set of assumptions. But in this 80% renewable scenario, you still have, I'll call it, some base load-like plants, but then you build up a very different stack of generation profile, still meeting the overall demand as it goes forward, and then you get this little slice of gray at the top, which is actually what we call in this study curtailment. It was one of the interesting assumptions that we talked about for a long period of time, which is, what do you do with excess electricity if you have it? Well, in this study, we chose to just call it curtailment. We didn't put it back in the system. We didn't recycle it, which would be obviously the economic optimal way of thinking about it. Here we just said it's curtailed, it's got a cost of curtailment, rather than thinking about it as a zero cost resource. So this all looks, I'll call it, relatively manageable. When you convert to an off-peak time, it looks very, very different. And so here you see lots of curtailment. You see virtually no coal being used, and then a fair amount of cycling and on and off cycles of almost all of the resources. And so it's an operationally very different challenge, but technically it's still feasible to do that. And again, those are the 80% ITI scenarios. Sally, would you remind me how much till 5 o'clock, 5:15?
Like 5 minutes past 5.
5 minutes past 5. Okay.
And then that will give us like 10 minutes for questions.
Okay. All right. I'll keep going. You then had, let me contrast that. I'm going to contrast this 3 times here. That's the incremental technology improvement scenario. This is the evolutionary technology improvement scenario. And because those are difficult graphs, the big piece here is that you see a lot more CSP in both of these, and more solar, but also a fair amount of more curtailment. And what does that mean? It basically means that you've got more resources available than you can use in particularly those off-peak days, and therefore some more opportunity, I think, to use those electrons in different ways. You also, if you're a markets person, would recognize that those would be hours in the market where you would have incredibly negative pricing, and the current pricing policy regime probably wouldn't hold up on an economic feasibility standpoint. So again, a technical feasibility study, not an economic one in that sense. And then we've got the constrained transmission scenario as well. And here you see again, the upper curve is fairly regular. The lower one has a significant amount more of photovoltaics in it, almost no concentrating solar power in it because you can't get the power from the desert Southwest to the demand centers. And then also some more offshore wind, but I'll show you that in some more detail. Each of these solve, if I can use that term, over 8760. They meet the reliability requirements of today's National Electricity Reliability Council going forward on an hourly basis. What this also means is that the flexibility requirements in our standard scenario on fossil generators are very different. And again, I mentioned Ontario ramps their coal plants when they have them. They're phasing them out. 80 to 90% of a ramp rate of ramping of full capacity. That's very different than the way our coal plants have been designed and are operated. It's just a different paradigm of how you would go about doing things. But there are two things here. So this shows gas combustion turbines, combined cycles, and coal in the baseline scenario, and then in the 80% unconstrained transmission scenario. And you just see a lot more variability. You also see a lot less energy, of course, because most of the energy is coming from the renewable resources. But this looks like a headache to most traditional coal plant operators, not to some of the other ones who've been in other areas. Even the combined cycle ramping may be very fast for, I'll call it old vintage combined cycle fleets, but not current vintage ones that are being sold in the system today. And combustion turbines are pretty used to that kind of situation. This shows just a highlight of how concentrating solar power with thermal energy storage actually dispatches. So this is a load curve. This is the remaining load curve after the other variable renewables are subtracted from it. And this shows then, if you actually have CSP with thermal storage, how it actually will dispatch into the peaks because it's economically optimal to do that, as well as technically feasible to do that as well. Just another key, it's a small highlight of things. A couple tidbits on then constrained scenarios. So what we wanted to do was ask the question, have we been overly optimistic in thinking about an economically optimal situation where you could actually build transmission? And that may not be the right question, but the question would be, if you could not build transmission, because transmission tends to be, one, expensive, but two, very slow in terms of building out because of all of the interstate rules, all of the constituents that are involved in it, could you still meet 80%? And it turns out you can. And so in our baseline scenario, it's actually an enormous amount of new transmission. It's 110 to 190 million megawatt miles. It's about double our current transmission system. And people might want to say, well, geez, that seems like it's an excessive build out. What if we constrained that? So in a situation, what we did was we essentially limited any new transmission to existing corridors, not new ones, and no interconnection ties. So ERCOT, for example, stays isolated. And then we reran the scenarios and said, well, can you actually meet 80% scenario, the 80% requirement? And the answer actually is yes. And the mapping, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, looks moderately the same, but fairly different. You remember the large wind in the Great Plains, that reduced by about a factor of 2. Florida increases. Texas is now fully sufficient because it's required to be, but there are enough resources there. And California is slightly deficient from its state level, but it's connected to the WEC and things like that. But the interesting part for us was, could you constrain it and still meet the requirement? The answer is yes. What do you trade off? You trade off local resources for faraway resources, and that's a trade space that people just need to be aware of and think through in terms of how much PV goes on a roof, how much local wind or local biomass is developed versus, for example, wind in the Great Plains and then a transmission line across those states. So this is a complicated set of comparisons, but I wanted to put it up and just spend a little bit of time so you can see some of the trade spaces that we found in those constrained scenarios. So either constraining transmission or constraining flexibility. What does that mean? That means that we essentially increased the flexibility requirements on the system for dealing with the amount of renewable generation. So that means the capacity value of renewables was decreased. The reliability requirements was actually increased quite substantially, as well as the flexibility of those fossil fuel generators was decreased. So you can see in there that we had more operating reserve requirements, for example, in that system in terms of total capacity, because each reserve plant contributed less to the overall system. So you can see some of this trade space quite a bit. And in particular, when you constrain transmission, I mean, this went from 120 to about 30 million megawatt miles. You can see comparable losses in reduction in losses of T&D, et cetera. There is quite a bit of storage. New storage being built goes from about 20 gigawatts today to about 120 to 150 gigawatts. So there is new technology being built going forward. All of that is today's commercially available technologies, no new technology innovations. And in fact, in all of these studies, we didn't postulate new technology. We looked at today's commercial fleet and we said, okay, what does incremental technology improvement get you or evolutionary technology improvement get you? But we didn't put in, for example, enhanced geothermal systems, ocean energy, floating offshore wind, and things like that. It was a very conservative set of technology assumptions as we did that. This shows that about the same graph that I showed you before, but it shows you the impact of those technology assumptions in terms of where does it go. So you can see with no technology improvement, CSP actually doesn't actually contribute significantly to the system in 2050, but with evolutionary technology, it really does contribute quite a bit. So there's a lot of technology improvement opportunity in the CSP world, and the other ones are a bit more mixed. We pretty much use all of the geothermal we have available and almost all of the biomass available in any of those technology scenarios as well. A couple of the outputs, just to think through it. So one would anticipate that we see concomitant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. We do see that, about 80%, either on a burner tip level or a life cycle emissions level. We also see reductions in water demand and use in the power sector, which also could be an increasingly important aspect to think about as we go forward. And then we're always asked, well, doesn't that use a lot of land? And so we looked at those metrics as well, both for I'll call it fully disturbed lands or just marginally disturbed lands. And you can see some of the comparisons here relative to golf courses, corn production, and major roadways. So again, here's numbers. I think that's up to whoever wants to read the study and think about it. What does that mean for either your locality or for the country relative to the trade spaces of having the greenhouse gas reductions, the water reductions, et cetera. Economically, we also looked at the impact on direct costs on electricity prices. So these are average annual electricity prices in the different scenarios. And what you see here is a comparison against a number of different studies that came out from either the EPA or the Energy Information Administration relative to the range across all of the Renewable Electricity Futures Studies, which is the kind of light blue swath in the back. And you can see that our projections are not projections, but calculations are in the same ballpark, and in fact potentially lower in the outer years. Again, this depends upon the energy technology cost assumptions much more than on the fossil fuel assumptions as well. What we didn't include in these was the cost of the energy efficiency investments. We, of course, didn't look at household expenditures because we didn't do a full economy-wide model. So these are direct expenditures only, including all of the transmission upgrades or new builds that would be in there as well. So it looks fairly reasonable relative to the other analyses at that time and would need to be looked at in, of course, much more detail going forward. We also looked at the sensitivity of the different prices relative to different input assumptions. And here the key thing to look at least as I think about it, is what's the sensitivity in the price relative to technology improvement, constraining the transmission or any of the other constraints, demand, or fossil fuel prices. And of course, because fossil fuel doesn't contribute a lot, the sensitivity is relatively low. Demand drives up price, as you would expect, because you'd have to build more supply, and a lot of that supply has low value. But the most interesting part, particularly for those sitting in a research university, is in fact the enormous potential impact of technology innovation. And it really is, I think, motivation for us to just work harder, particularly in today's low gas price environment. We looked at the manufacturing capability. This just shows kind of an annual build out of what the annual installations might look like, again, on an economic optimization, not on a business perspective. Somewhere between 20 and maybe as high as 40 or 50 gigawatts. That's not really unsurmountable compared to both US installations as they have been, but also worldwide installations and worldwide production capacity as they have been. So kind of the takeaway where was, industry probably could respond to that and would actually probably like that, to be able to really grow and work that well. The other piece that I do want to just spend a second on is really this impact of high demand. And I think it's really important because those base assumptions of really implementing energy efficiency tend to get lost in the messages because it's a study of renewable electricity futures. But as the national academies have done, and many studies out of here and elsewhere, the energy intensity of the US economy is enormous compared to most other countries. And while California leads the pack and has done for decades, the rest of the country has a long way to go to really catch up on this. And this just shows the impact on the requirements for the different technologies going forward. And we would have to build a lot more supply and deal with a lot more of the flexibility integration if we were not to curb our increase in demand. And I think that it's worth thinking through what that really means, particularly given overall national consumption levels. So key results, there are 4 here. I'm not going to read through them. I think the key thing is that we found in a technical assessment that up to 80% renewable scenarios are technically feasible on an hourly basis, meeting today's reliability constraints and requirements, and a number of different constraint scenarios and sensitivity scenarios also indicated feasibility at the national level for meeting those kind of renewable electricity futures. Such a future would require more flexibility both in the operation of the system, but also going forward in the policy and market design elements of that system itself, thinking of it. The abundance and diversity of the US resources really allows us multiple different pathways. We didn't decide on a given pathway. We wanted to say is, are there multiple pathways? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes, given our resource base. And that the incremental cost is actually comparable to at least other analyses of decarbonization of the power sector that were done at that particular time, and actually might be the same for those that are done today, which are not enormous. My term, sorry, not a term that we used in the study. They're real between about 0.5% and 1.2% per year going forward. So they're not a large leap, and that's on the power price, not on the total cost of power, because if you look at reduced demand times the quantity of the price going up, the actual expenditures may or may not be flat or decreasing depending upon what your own individual use is, etc. Where are we going from now? We have a lot more rigorous reliability assessment to be doing, sub-hourly, looking at frequency response, looking at contingency to outages and things like that. We have a lot of work to look at the market flexibility issues and the policy side of that equation, which will be going forward. So we're in discussions with DOE now about what that might look like. And then, of course, continued work on the technology innovation side which is one of the most important factors on the cost of realizing such a future. So let me skip through that. And what I really want to do is, while we do questions, show a couple of visuals, if I might. And I hope I can get these up. Uh-oh. Okay, so let's see if I can get the next one up. Sorry, we're working on the web here. Ooh. So what we have here is, uh-oh, I can't get the graph down on the right. Anybody really fluid with a different resolutions as it's approached? All right, I'll let you see the western part of the U.S. This is the build out of capacity expansion from 2010 through 2050, and you can see the growth of the resources being built out in the western part. Sorry, I can't resize it to show you the whole country. And then you see the graph on the right-hand side. And let me see if I can get you the next graph. These are all up on the website. And see if I, oh boy. Okay, you're going to see a bit. This is actually a visual of the hourly dispatch of the electricity system for the country. And what you see in the moving graph is the dispatch by hour built up again in that stack of it's fossil and nuclear built at the bottom, and then bio, geo, hydro, et cetera. And if you can focus your slice of your visual, at least on the bottom, you can see the sun rise in the east by the solar coming up, the bright yellow spots in Florida, and then actually setting, and then rising as it goes to the west. And it's a lot more impactful if I could show you it without that big graph in the middle of it, but I apologize for the logistics pieces of it. But I encourage you to go to the website and see those. It's nrel.gov/REFutures. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for inviting me out, and I hope that captured the highlights. So.
Okay, questions? Okay, how about you, Charlie?
Hey, that's a great study. A lot of valuable insight. I'm curious about the storage energy capacity. It has about 110, 150 gigawatts of power capacity. How long is that discharge? A couple hours, 6 hours?
That's a good question that I don't have the answer to off the top of my head. We can dig it out of the actual energy supplied by it. Off the top of my head, I think that it's less than. Well, let me put it this way: it's less than about 8 hours per day, on average total. But we can look at the detail of it and get you that. So the trade space between storage and demand response, when we took on this study now 3 years ago, was a fairly broad unknown. We restricted storage to really well understood, well characterized storage technologies. There's no advanced batteries in here, things like that. This is K's, pumped hydro, things like that. And demand response at that point in time really was a pretty big unknown. There's a new technical feasibility study of demand response for the country coming out soon by DOE, and I think that our estimates in here are actually fairly low relative to what that will look like. But the storage is called upon just a little bit, also because it's expensive, but it's needed.
Okay, great. Yeah, how about you back over there?
I'm curious, you mentioned you're looking now at sub-hourly issues, and I'm wondering, now that demand response is, I think, being viewed more, as having opportunities in the sub-hourly balancing of the grid, are you looking at that in your current work?
We are, yes. So part of the ongoing work is to update at least a subset of these scenarios with current technical assessments of capability, and then we will do a fair amount of the sub-hourly work at smaller geographic regions because of just computational limitations. And so in those, we will use the most up-to-date demand response scenarios or technology assessments that we can for those areas.
Okay, more questions. Any more students? Yeah, no? Okay, all right, yeah, go ahead.
I was just curious, what sort of capacity value did you end up with for the high renewable penetrations?
So capacity value changes as a function of the penetration, as I tried to describe earlier. So the 0 to teens percents of variable renewables all have, depending on the technology, say 20 to 30% capacity value, and then that follows a functional form that we've developed and analyzed in quite some detail to the point where the nth one, nth being greater than 30 or 40 or 50%, has almost no capacity value added to the system.
That transition to almost none is in what range of percent?
That transition occurs between 20 and 40%, but it depends on the specifics of the system, the geographic dispersity within a given balancing area authority, and again, whether or not, for example, CSP has storage built onto it or not. So I wouldn't look for an easy answer to that, but look at it in quite some detail.
Okay, I think, did you have a question up here on the second row? You, yeah.
Yeah. Did you take into consideration the potential of increased demand that may be kind of out of the ordinary? From what I'm seeing from my own personal experience, as we become a more electronic society, I've seen homes with multiple computers, multiple TV screens, big huge kitchens. It just seems that the residential side the homes are being built with much larger capacity for demand, and I'm just wondering, is there a possibility that demand may actually grow at a faster pace than we're currently looking at?
So in the baseline scenario that we developed, the residential sector actually pulls to a pretty flat demand growth profile between about 2030 and 2050, maybe as early as 2025. Same with the commercial sector. So that has an enormous number of behavior, maybe in purchasing assumptions in it. In the baseline scenario, the high demand scenario did not assume that flattening, and that continues at essentially EIA reference levels of about 1.2% per year. So that might be able to capture that. Again, assuming efficiencies are captured in other sectors as well. So it would have to play out.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, okay, we'll go with you. Yes.
Is the 80% fixed by modeling, or is it fixed by equipment?
The 80%, so the scenarios we looked at were between 30 and 90, and we fixed those. That was a constraint on the modeling scenario, so we said by 2050 or in 2050, the energy in the power system had to be X percent, 30 or 90% for the whole country. So not for each state or each balancing area, but for the whole country on average. And so it's a modeling parameter that's constrained.
Okay, sorry, I think we better wrap up now, but Doug will be up here if you have any more questions. And anyway, thanks for the wonderful talk, and please join us for the Energy Social.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.